We have seen animated Christmas carols and musical Christmas carols and Disneyfied Christmas carols and modernized Christmas carols, but since 1951, there have not been many straightforward live-action adaptations. There's the 25-minute Basil Rathbone one from 1959, and the 1977 BBC one starring Michael Hordern, but those are a half hour and an hour of TV respectively, not feature-length films. However, in 1984, we got another straightforward, feature-length adaptation of A Christmas Carol. This one is often called a TV movie, and it was in the United States, but A Christmas Carol actually got a theatrical release in the United Kingdom. The film was directed by Clive Donner, who made some iconic 60s British comedies like What's New, Pussycat and Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, but who was also the editor of the 1951 film Scrooge. Even more so than other directors, Donner likely wanted to deliberately differentiate his Carol from the iconic Sim version. George C. Scott, who had previously worked with Donner on an adaptation of Oliver Twist, was cast as Scrooge. Scott was initially hesitant about playing Scrooge, saying later in a career retrospective, quote, "I didn't want to do it because of Alistair Sim's version. That seemed to be the definitive version. But I found a way to approach the character. I decided that he was the loneliest man in the world, and that's how I played him." It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Colin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be looking at every film and TV adaptation of A Christmas Carol I can, because I love the story that much. Join me this season as I go from Mickey Mouse to the Muppets on Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Season 2, Episode 4, My Favorite Version of A Christmas Carol. Scott was an American actor, known for tough guy roles like George Patton or General Buck Turgidson from Dr. Strangelove, but these were far from the only roles he could play. He has a few moments here where he raises his voice, but for the most part, his Scrooge is cold and internal, not brash and commanding. Quick note here that I promise I won't bring up again in the episode proper. Most people will tell you that George C. Scott doesn't do a British accent as Scrooge. I don't think this is actually true. He poshes up his voice a bit, and there are some undeniably British pronunciations. I always assumed he was at least suggesting one or going for something transatlantic. The 1984 New York Times review agrees with me and calls it a mid-Atlantic accent. I'm an American, but it absolutely never bothered me, and I only ever thought about it because others brought it up. It's not an over-the-top accent, but I think it works. From the first moments of the film, you realize you're experiencing a version made with love and care. You learn so much about this version of the story in just a few seconds. We start on a foggy London street with eerie music and bells tolling. The narrator, whom we soon learn is Scrooge's nephew Fred, tells us that Marley was dead. A hearse passes by, and we cut to a group of carolers on the street singing the Sussex Carol, which beautifully transitions us into the film's theme. Christmas Carol is a story that balances dark and light brilliantly, and we see that immediately here. Additionally, we see just how lived in this film is. So many previous versions of A Christmas Carol were clearly shot on sound stages. Even the 1951 film, great as it is, has some obvious soundstage shots that'll take you right out of it. This film was shot on location in the city of Shrewsbury, which is in the English county of Shropshire. The location shooting makes a world of difference, and it makes the story come alive in ways other live action adaptations haven't been able to. The only exception so far is An American Christmas Carol, which was set in the Great Depression and filmed on location in Toronto. It's not filmed where it's set, but it suggests that time period of the United States well enough. The score is by Nick Bicât, who also wrote the opening theme, God Bless Us Everyone, with Tony Bicât. The podcast Totally Rad Christmas recently had an episode interviewing Nick Bicât about the score, which I'll link in the description. There are snippets of multiple carols throughout this adaptation, and God Bless Us Everyone fits right alongside them. It sounds right out of the era, and its lyrics show a great understanding that A Christmas Carol is about a societal problem, not just one man's problem. Here are the opening lines of the three verses. The past of man was cold as ice, he would not mend his ways. The present man is full of flame, he rushes here and there. The man to come we do not know, may he make peace on earth. This is clearly an adaptation where everyone cared, and it shows right away. In addition to this song, the score is wonderful, always matching the scene perfectly. It becomes particularly prominent, almost operatic, in the yet to come scenes, which seems to almost give voice to the ghost. It's a really beautiful score. I'm going to talk a lot about George C. Scott and the role of Scrooge, but it's also important to note the wonderful supporting cast. If you've watched a lot of British films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you're going to recognize a lot of faces here. David Warner plays Bob Cratchit, and he plays the role with such kindness, patience, and love for his wife and children that you will forget anybody else has ever played it. We can talk about the definitive Scrooge, and trust me, we will, but there is no doubt in my mind that David Warner is the definitive Bob Cratchit. Warner had a long resume up until this point, from Time Bandits to The Omen. He was often typecast as villains, so it's no surprise that he was originally offered the role of Jacob Marley. However, Warner was able to convince them to give him the Cratchit role instead, and the film is all the better for it. In another brilliant piece of casting, Scrooge's nephew Fred is played by Roger Rees. At this point in his career, Rees was best known for his Tony winning work on stage in a two-part, 8.5 hour version of Nicholas Nickleby, where he played the title role. Rees is so incredibly charismatic here, even outshining Barry McKay's wonderful performance as Fred from the 1938 film. Like many Freds, Rees has a perpetual smile, but his happy-go-lucky nature is contrasted by his deep sadness for his uncle.
Merry Christmas, Uncle. I said, Merry Christmas, Uncle. Humbug.
It's also very clear that he's still grieving his mother, which enriches the performance and makes Fred feel like a whole person. Overall, this is the most character-driven take on the story so far. A lot of versions make Fred just a plot device, often only including him at the very beginning, at the very end, and not for long at either place. But this is the best take on the character yet. One thing you'll notice about this adaptation is that it's not entirely beholden to the book's dialogue. The script was written by Roger O'Herson, who was best known for writing the book for the Broadway musical Pippin. Now, he often incorporates long passages right out of Dickens' book, but there are other times where words are rearranged to sound more natural. The 1977 Michael Hordern version kept large portions of the dialogue, but it never understood why a character was saying a line. Here, in every scene, it is clear that the writer and actor are putting great thought into why their character is saying something. One early example comes when Scrooge is delivering his famous line about being boiled in your own pudding and being buried with a stake of holly through your heart. Scott Scrooge is laughing at himself saying these lines, clearly proud of himself for being as ridiculous as possible. Here's Michael Hordern saying the line.
If I could work my will, every idiot that goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart.
And here's Scott.
If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart.
See how in the Scott version it just never feels like the actors are just saying their lines. Scrooge runs into the charity workers, played by Michael Gough and John Quambley, at the London Exchange in this version, which works just fine. Instead of following the Fred scene with another scene of Scrooge sitting down and arguing with someone, this film opts to liven it up just a little bit by setting it somewhere bustling. Most of the changes this adaptation makes aren't big ones, but rather small ones that spice up a scene without changing the gist of the scene. You get the impression that with every scene, they were looking for something that could make it breathe just a little bit more. Something that could just make it a little more vivid or engaging. These little details may not seem like much on their own, but when you add them together, they do really propel this version into greatness. On the way to the exchange, Scrooge brushes off Tiny Tim, who is waiting for his father, and two separate groups of carolers, which once again takes a small scene from the book and makes it move a little more. At the exchange, we also see Scrooge do business with three men buying corn from him. He had quoted a price yesterday, and they didn't take it, so now he's raised it a bit, and he threatens to raise it more if they don't take it. When they say it's not fair, Scrooge agrees, but says it's business. So we get back to the burning question I always find myself asking: is Scrooge an honest businessman here? To me, this is one of the most crucial aspects of the character, and if the adaptation gets it wrong, it shows a lack of understanding of the story and its themes. I've seen some people suggest that this price hike makes Scrooge more of a villain, but I don't really think so. He's ruthless, but he's not doing anything illegal. Additionally, there's nothing else in the film that suggests that he's anything but honest, so I can give this adaptation the full honest businessman point. Scrooge's walk home is eerie here, with fog covering the street and Marley's voice calling out to Scrooge from what appears to be his hearse, which then disappears into the fog. Scott plays the fear extremely well, as we see that he is deeply unnerved by what is going on, but he doesn't overplay it when he sees Marley on the door knocker. He's taken aback, but he doesn't scream or run away in fear. He just tries to convince himself that his mind's playing tricks on him. The book describes Marley on the door knocker as having a quote, dismal glow about him, and that is captured here perfectly. The bluish glow of Marley's face is deeply unsettling. The build up to Marley appearing is also done very well, and we even get the rarely adapted bit from the book where Marley's face pops up on Scrooge's biblical murals. Here, it's an etching of the Last Supper, and while the close up of the mural doesn't really match the exterior shots, it's nice to see nonetheless. The haunting score builds, and bells announce Marley's arrival. However, there's a really nice touch in that when Marley finally enters, the haunting music changes to a sad violin piece. A good adaptation needs to have empathy for Marley, and we get it here. Frank Finlay, perhaps best known for his Oscar nominated performance as Iago in Laurence Olivier's Othello, plays Marley here. It's a fine take on the character, but it always leaves me feeling a little underwhelmed. The performance is a little over the top and a little wooden, and both of these seem quite common for Marley performances. Scott sells the rapport between the two men, but Finlay is trying to be ghostly and otherworldly in a way that I don't quite think lands.
Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
I also think that the reason this scene doesn't quite land for me is that everything else in the movie goes above and beyond, and this doesn't. Like I mentioned before, there are these little things in almost every scene that enhance it, make it memorable. There isn't anything like that in the Marley scene. It's a straightforward take on the scene. Marley also says that warning Scrooge about the three ghosts is part of his penance. In the book, it's clear that Marley was the one who arranged for their visits. And I suppose you could read it that way here, but I do wish it were a little clearer. When Marley opens the window to leave, we get a brief take on the wandering spirits scene, as we hear the voices of ghosts crying out. It's quite a haunting scene, and they don't overdo it either. It's clearly the sound of them trying and failing to help people, and the suffering that comes from emotional pain. Maybe it's a budgetary choice to only hear them and not see them, or maybe it's a stylistic one, but I think it works. The film's opening is strong, and the Marley scene works just fine. But it's when the Ghost of Christmas Past shows up that this movie really starts to take off. The ghost is played by Angela Pleasence, and while she doesn't really resemble the character as described in the book, she more than makes up for it with her performance. She's less passive than the ghost is in the book, but since Scott Scrooge is more aggressive, at least a little bit, this works. She brings plenty of gravitas to the role, and she does show empathy for Scrooge. But there is something a little distant in her delivery, which is quite appropriate for the Ghost of Christmas Past.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past.
Her hair also glows just a little bit, which suggests the light from the book without being distracting. There's also this twinge of creepiness to her performance, which usually isn't seen with this character, and she seems to get just a little joy out of making Scrooge revisit some painful memories. It's a great twist on the character. One of the strongest things about this take on A Christmas Carol is the way Scrooge interacts with the visions. In the book, Scrooge tries to interact with the boys leaving school, but is told they can't see or hear him. Many versions keep this interaction and then simply have Scrooge watch from a distance from there on out. There are occasional exceptions, of course, like Alistair Sim's Scrooge being so moved to tears by the vision of Fan's death in the 1951 film that he begs her forgiveness even though she can't hear him. Albert Finney's Scrooge seems to just forget that he can't interact with visions, as he regularly tries to strike up conversations with them. However, George C. Scott's Scrooge regularly walks right up to people and watches them, sits down next to them, and talks about them with the spirit. It's such a dynamic way to play these scenes, and it gives Scrooge so much more to do than just watch and then talk a little bit. There was one very touching moment in An American Christmas Carol where Henry Winkler's Benedict Slade reached out to touch that film's version of Bob Cratchit and stopped himself. But this one does it the whole way through. When Scrooge sits down next to his young self at school, he talks about how much the boy loved books. We don't see the characters jump out of the page, but we know how real they were for Scrooge. And his genuine delight at remembering these characters is played perfectly by Scott.
Robinson Crusoe, not real. And Friday, and the parrot with green body and yellow tail, not real.
Scrooge also defends his younger self as someone who made do, which tells us so much about his character. He's defending that little boy left alone at school as someone who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, instead of someone who was the victim of an emotionally distant and cruel father. In the next scene, though, we learn exactly how Scrooge feels about his father. We cut to a few years later, where Scrooge, as a young man, played now by Mark Strickson, is visited at school by his sister Fan, played by Joanne Whalley. Here, they make Fan the older sister, and Scrooge's mother died giving birth to Scrooge. However, it's made clear that Fan did not do the same in her adulthood, unlike the Alistair Sim version. In a lot of versions, Fan feels like something of an afterthought, but even though she's only in this one scene, he casts a shadow over this whole film in a way that she rarely does. While a lot of versions like to depict Belle as the best relationship in Scrooge's life, this one makes it clear that it was his sister. And Scrooge could have that again by growing closer to his nephew. Even Scott Scrooge, who takes more time to warm up to these visions of the past than many others, has nothing but love for her. However, just when we think things are going well for Scrooge's family, we cut to the exterior of the school and see Scrooge's father, played by Nigel Davenport. Even before he says a word, we know that nothing has changed, despite what Fan may have said. Young Scrooge tries to greet his father enthusiastically, but he is saddened to learn that his father really only wants him home for 3 days and will be sending him off to Fezziwigs after that. As this scene is playing out, Scott Scrooge walks up behind his younger self and stares coldly at his father. With just this expression, we know everything we need to know about this relationship. The performances in this film are extremely expressive yet subtle. It's one of those films you could watch on mute and understand nearly everything being communicated. Watch the very brief moment where Fan gets into the carriage after her father confirms Scrooge will only be home for 3 days. She's lost any excitement she had earlier in the scene, and as she turns to face the carriage, her expression is clearly stating Dad's back to his old ways again. Brilliant and heartbreaking. This is the only scene in the movie where we see Wally or Davenport, but they both give us powerhouse performances nonetheless. Listen to this exchange between Scrooge and the ghost once the carriage drives off.
Fan pleaded for more time, but my father was very stern man. Fan.
She died a young woman.
She had such a generous nature. Yes, too young.
That little way in which Scott interrupts his own line of thinking to make an offhand remark that she died too young, that's why this movie is so great. Scrooge doesn't want to think about her death, so it's an offhand remark, and yet he still wants to acknowledge it because he owes it to the sister he loves so much. The Fezziwig party is appropriately joyful and fun, but with a few added character moments that this movie does so well. I like how Fezziwig, played by Timothy Bateson, goes out of his way to praise Scrooge for his work and then encourages him to play as hard as he works. It's a great way to show the kind of man Fezziwig is, and it's nice that we then see Scrooge doing just that. He's a little awkward about it, but he does it anyway. This is probably the most believable transformation from young Scrooge to old, which is saying something because in a lot of movies, it's the same actor playing young and old Scrooge. It's not here. When we meet Belle, played by Lucy Gutteridge, we see the love that both old and young Scrooge have for her. Strixon and Gutteridge have such good chemistry as a young couple, and Scott Scrooge is happy to look back fondly on better times. There's also a nice added detail that Belle says Scrooge has changed since coming to Fezziwig, which means she's known him for some time. Since Scrooge's father never actually improved in this version, it was Fezziwig who was the caring father figure in his life. Belle gets a little more development in the breakup scene too, as she calls out Scrooge for not giving a direct response when she asks if he would seek her out now. Scott Scrooge defends himself by saying that when his father died, Belle wanted to use the money to get married, but he was insecure about not being rich enough and loaned it out to start his business. It's a little expansion on something from the book that feels right in line with it. We also get a brief scene of Belle and her family, and this is the rare time where I think this scene actually works. Here, both Belle and her husband pity Scrooge, as opposed to other versions where her husband is anywhere from blasé to amused by Scrooge's misfortune. It also highlights Scrooge's insecurity, as he says he doesn't want anyone's pity, and he snuffs out the ghost with her extinguisher cap. It's such a believable step in the transformation, as Scrooge is softening, but he's still a proud man, so he's not all the way there yet. Want even more Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast? Just go to my Patreon at patreon.com/Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast, where for just $5 a month, you can get a bonus episode every month of the year. There, I cover various TV shows versions of A Christmas Carol, and this month I'll be covering Family Ties, A Keaton Family Christmas. For $10 a month, you can even vote on what episode I do next. Additionally, for just $1 a month, you can get all episodes 24 hours early. Again, just go to patreon.com/Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast, or follow the link in the description. Scrooge attempts to go back to sleep, but is woken up by the ghost of Christmas Present, played by Edward Woodward, best known for his roles in The Wicker Man and The Equalizer. Between the beard, the height, and the accent, I have always thought he was unrecognizable here. He really nails this character, being both full of joy and never once letting Scrooge get away with anything.
You never walked forth with any of the younger members of my family?
No, not that I remember.
Nor any of my elder brothers born these later years?
Like with Angela Pleasence's Christmas Past, there's an underlying creepiness to him too, particularly as the day goes on, and it really works. I have no idea if this was intentional or not, but the accent Woodward uses to play the ghost is very similar to that of Roger Rees, who plays Fred. It could be suggesting that Fred is the character with the most Christmas spirit, or if we're operating on dream logic, Scrooge is projecting Fred as the embodiment of Christmas spirit. The 1954 TV version did this directly by having the same actor play both, but I like the subtle touch here. Scrooge and the ghost walk the streets on Christmas morning, and like in the opening scenes, they feel so bustling and lived in. It's incredibly charming, and Scott and Woodward have such wonderful chemistry. Scrooge seems to have a begrudging respect for the fact that the ghost could be as snarky as him. Christmas Past had her moments too, but it's amped up with Present. I've mentioned in the past that it can be really hard to nail the Cratchit Christmas dinner scene without feeling a little saccharine. There's a lot of information that needs to be communicated, and while it works well in writing, it can be tough on screen. This film nails it for a few reasons. The big one is that Scrooge and the ghost are inside the house with the Cratchits, instead of just looking through a window as the scene plays out. Scrooge is up close and personal with his employees' family, and this leads to both touching and humorous moments. Scrooge is genuinely moved by how supportive the whole family is of Tiny Tim, and he is so moved by Bob's prayer that he subconsciously lets out an amen at the end of it. This leads the ghost to troll him a bit, and Scrooge to humorously deny he said anything.
We thank you for allowing us to be together, to share with each other and with you the fullness of our hearts on this special day. Amen.
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 What? You say something?
No.
No. I thought I...
No, I said nothing.
The ghost also really tears into him for the surplus population bit, which is immensely satisfying.
But if he is to die, then let him die, and decrease the surplus population.
You use my own words against me.
So perhaps in the future you will hold your tongue until you have discovered what the surplus population is and where it is. It may well be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child.
A lot of actors will play this part passively, but Woodward's ghost is not having it. The other reason it works so well is the performances of David Warner and Susannah York as the Cratchits. Pretty much every version will focus on the Cratchits' family togetherness, but this version specifically shows that the parents' happy marriage is a big part of how they survive. York and Warner have such incredible chemistry that I have more than once had to remind myself that they weren't actually married in real life. They share a kiss under the mistletoe, which tells you everything you need to know about them. The Cratchit kids are all believable too. Tiny Tim definitely looks sickly here, and they do a good job of not making him overly saintly, as, like in the book, he's clearly disgusted by the toast to Scrooge like the rest of his family. The pacing of this film is one of its greatest strengths, as it really lets us soak in each scene. Unlike so many versions that rush right through Fred's party or don't show it at all, we spend considerable time at it here, but it never feels drawn out or slow. Scrooge gets to see Fred in his day to day life, and he genuinely comes to like him over the course of the scene. Scrooge sees Fred joking about him, but he also sees him genuinely talk about how much he cares about him and how much his mother loves Scrooge, too. This leads to yet another reflection on Fan from Scrooge. I really love the way she hangs over this whole adaptation.
The reason that I talk about my uncle, sir, is that my mother, God rest her saintly soul, was very fond of him. She loved him.
It's true. Fan loved me, and I her. Dear Fan. I wish you were alive today.
Fred and Scrooge clearly both need somebody to talk about their dear memories of Fan with, because so many people didn't know her like they did. If Fred's father is not in the picture, they're presumably the only two people who knew her that well, and they need to reminisce with each other. It's really a beautiful look at grief and togetherness. The guests at Fred's party play a game of similes, and there's a really charming moment where Fred is excitedly explaining the rules and he stumbles over his words a bit. It's very human and real, as he's always in full energy party host mode. Scrooge also gets very into this game, getting upset if players don't know an answer. Like the 20 questions variant in the book, there's a dig at Scrooge when Fred's wife Janet answers tight as with your Uncle Scrooge's purse strings. Scrooge is actually amused by this. Again, he likes someone who can give as good as him. There's also a great moment where the ghost shushes Ebenezer for giving an answer. I like the idea of the ghost being a little absent-minded because he's the ghost of the present. The Muppet version would make this a running joke, and I wonder if they're a little inspired by this. The ghost then takes Ebenezer to a tunnel where many homeless people are gathered on Christmas night. There's a brilliant little touch where one scene fades into another as a party guest is guessing the simile, silent as the grave. It's just one of those countless things that makes this version special. Scrooge sees a family, a darker reflection of the Cratchits essentially, who are happy to be together on Christmas but have no home and are struggling to get by. The father tells them to go to the workhouse the next day, but the mother insists that they can't be separated. Scrooge tells the ghost that they must have a place to go, and the ghost asks him if he's ever visited the workhouses he speaks of. This scene isn't in the book, but it feels extremely in line with it. Another strong scene emphasizing the need to help those less fortunate, it's welcomed, particularly in 1984, the height of 80s greed and excess, when the popular messages were Reaganomics and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. The ignorance and want scene is properly haunting, with dramatic music and Woodward really going for it with all the gravitas he can. Scrooge is genuinely worried when he sees the ghost will be leaving him in this fearful place he's never been before. This movie makes some brilliant stylistic choices to make the Christmas yet to come scenes haunting. We have an idea of the ghost's form, but we don't ever see it fully lit, which previous versions have been harmed by. If we ever think it's just an actor in a cloak, it's not eerie. Here, it is eerie. Additionally, All of the Christmas Yet to Come scenes take place at night, meaning we don't have an ounce of daylight after Fred's party until Christmas morning. Another one of those choices that makes this movie brilliant. People cared. The ghost is played by Michael Carter, who's probably best known for playing Jabba the Hutt's number 2, Bib Fortuna, in Return of the Jedi. Okay, here is one of my favorite little details about this movie. Watch when Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come approach the London Exchange. There are a few groups of men talking, but they're barely moving, and it's almost like they're actors on a stage who've been arranged formally, or like a set of dolls in a dollhouse. It adds a level of artifice to this, which works really well, since this is a shadow of the future that isn't real yet. There's nothing else like this in the rest of Yet to Come, as it all feels very real once it starts, but I love this. After he hears men talking about him at the exchange, Scrooge is taken to a room where a body lies under a sheet. This version absolutely nails the fact that Scrooge knows he's the dead man and is buying for time, in addition to hoping there was someone who cared about him. We even see Scrooge ask to see some emotion connected to the man's death, which leads him to Old Joe's shop. Since they don't do the scene with the couple relieved he died, I think this works just fine. The people selling his things are definitely feeling some emotions about it. Scrooge even walks right up to his things to confirm they're his. It's such a brilliant choice that you wonder why almost no Scrooge has done it before. When Scrooge asks to see tenderness and depth of feeling, he's taken to the Cratchits. David Warner and Susannah York play this scene heartbreakingly well. They both look so tired and aged in this scene without excessive makeup or anything. It's just the weariness we know they're feeling due to the loss of their son. Warner plays Cratchit as such a genuine, loving father that it really leaves us feeling like this family will be able to get through anything.
However, and whenever we are parted from one another, I'm sure that none of us will ever forget poor Tiny Tim.
No, never.
And when we recollect how patient he was, and how mild, although he was but a little child, I'm sure that we will not easily quarrel among ourselves.
I am a happy man.
Upon viewing this scene, Scrooge acknowledges that there is nothing more he needs to see. While this is partially to avoid having to learn that he's dead, I do think this is also essentially true. His redemption is fully realized by this point, but there is still one more extremely powerful scene that needs to happen. Scrooge asks to be taken home, and the ghost takes him to a graveyard. I love the detail that even this ghost has a sarcastic sense of humor. Scott plays the redemption scene with wonderful emotion, but still in the fairly subtle way he's been playing the character throughout. He is moved to tears, but he isn't crawling on the ground or screaming out. He's already figured this out long before he wipes the snow off that tombstone. This version keeps Scrooge's line to the ghost, "Your nature intercedes for me and pities me," and it's made even more powerful because Scrooge was begging not to be pitied previously.
Good spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Say that I may change these things by an altered life.
Again, it shows why he's saying this line, and it represents great character development. Like with everything in this film, the Christmas morning scenes are paced perfectly. So many versions rush through these like they're going through the motions, or they spend too much time on something unimportant, and we don't see Scrooge living out his redemption. Scott is just delightful in these scenes, and we have no doubt that the change has taken effect for good. It's nice that in this version, Scrooge even leaves some money for a group of carolers he had scorned the day before. When he promises payment to the charity workers, the formerly somber men become downright giddy like schoolboys, which is just great to see. There's also a nice little callback to the charity workers scene when Bob Cratchit asks who delivered the turkey and is told the sender, quote, wishes to remain anonymous. Then we get the scene that, despite all the wonderful moments up until this point, is the best of the film. Scrooge goes to Fred's and asks forgiveness for his previous behavior. I've talked a lot about Roger Rees and how brilliant he is as Fred, but it's also important to note the performance of Carolyn Langrish as Janet, Fred's wife. This is really the only version so far where she's a character instead of a plot device, and Langrish is just wonderful. She's clearly protective of her husband and doesn't want him to get his hopes up about his uncle, a totally understandable position. But as soon as Scrooge offers genuine remorse and apology, we see her face light up even before Fred's.
Well, I've come for 3 reasons. First, to beg your pardon for the things I said about Christmas. That was a humbug, Fred.
Was it?
I didn't know it then, but I know it now. Secondly, I've come to meet your wife.
Well, here she is.
Yes. And a very beautiful woman she is, too.
Thank you.
I was in love once. Would you believe that?
Yes.
After some polite conversation about games, where Scrooge gives Janet the answer she missed in his vision, Scrooge talks to Fred about Fan again. It's such a beautiful interaction, and Scott plays it perfectly. Again, this version really understands grief and loss, with Scrooge suggesting that maybe he avoided Fred because he reminds him so much of his sister.
You'll forgive me for saying this, but I see the shadow of my sister in your face. I loved your mother, Fred. For a time there, I forgot just how much I loved her. Perhaps I chose to forget. Well, now, if it isn't too much trouble, I should like to sample some of that punch for which you're so famous.
Of course. You've made us both very happy, Uncle Ebenezer.
Have I?
Yes.
God forgive me for the time I wasted.
The physical resemblance between Fred and Fan is something both Christmas past and present pointed out, and thankfully Joanne Whalley and Roger Rees do have a strong resemblance. The scene the next day when Scrooge makes up to Bob Cratchit is lovely too. Warner's Cratchit mostly just freezes in place when he sees that Scrooge has changed, because he simply cannot process what is going on. We end with some narration from Fred, confirming that Scrooge's change was for good, and we even get a shout out to the 1951 film as Tiny Tim runs up to Scrooge, who then lifts him up before walking off with him. When the film was released, it got strong reviews, and it's only become more beloved over the years. This is bound to happen with almost any Christmas film that gets re-aired year after year. Heck, I've seen Christmas with the Cranks revisionism. But in the case of A Christmas Carol 1984, it's fully deserved. There are countless things that work wonderfully here, but the reason it's an all-timer is the subtle, humorous, and incredibly heartfelt performance of George C. Scott as Ebenezer Scrooge. Not to get too parasocial or anything, but Scott was known as a gruff man with a temper in his younger days. But by this point in his career, he had apparently mellowed out considerably, so he knew a thing or two about a change in one's character. David Warner even spoke to this years later, saying that he was nervous about working with Scott due to both his stature and reputation, but he found him an extremely pleasant man to work with, and they got on well right away. During downtime on set, they would play Trivial Pursuit, and Warner said that Scott's anger only ever flared up if the questions about George Patton were incorrect. When I talked about Scrooge 1951 with Alistair Sim, I talked about how many considered that version and that portrayal of the character to be definitive, even if maybe I don't. Even though Scott is my favorite portrayal of Scrooge, I actually don't think I'd say he's the definitive Ebenezer Scrooge in pop culture. He doesn't look all that much like the thin, wiry Scrooge of the book in so many adaptations, as Scott was a stockier, more imposing figure. He's also a little more aggressive than the Scrooge of the book. Again, I have no problem with this, it's my favorite take. But when I read the book, I'm not necessarily picturing Scott. If I had to pick a portrayal that's definitive, it's probably Alistair Sim, but Alistair Sim in the 1971 cartoon, where Scrooge is drawn to match his book description. That said, we all have our favorites, and it's enjoyable that there are so many to choose from. I do think this is the definitive telling of the story, as it follows the book closely while also fleshing out the characters and hammering home the message perfectly. If you asked me to list off films with the best acting overall, it wouldn't take long for me to get to this one. Everyone is turning in exquisite work here, and I find something new in one of the performances every time I watch. This time it was Joanne Whalley's mildly amusing annoyance when she realizes that her father hasn't changed at all. That tiny moment gives Fan a little extra agency, and maybe even gives us the impression that she and Scrooge shared a sense of humor. In addition to Scrooge and Fan, I think that this version gives us the best versions of Christmas Present and Yet to Come, Bob Cratchit, Mrs. Cratchit, and Fred. Any of these could be upstaged by a version I haven't seen yet or I've forgotten, but I doubt it. Honestly, the only criticisms I have are things that are just fine as opposed to things that are bad, because nothing is bad here. I find the Marley scene a bit overcooked, and Tiny Tim isn't super memorable. That's it. Like I said last season, there tend to be three versions these days that are held in the highest regard among Christmas Carol fans, and this is the third most of them from what I've seen. If for some reason you've never seen this one, or you haven't seen it in a while, do yourself a favor and really watch it. Pay attention to those little things because they're really what pushes this movie into greatness. It's clear that everyone working on this movie cared, and in the process, they created a true masterpiece. Let's take a look at where A Christmas Carol 1984 lands on the Christmas Carol adaptation meter. Well, for the first time this season, we have ourselves a new leader. A Christmas Carol 1984 scores a 74 on the adaptation meter, pushing the Michael Hordern version from 1977 off the top spot. There are a handful of moments we get in this version we rarely get, like Scrooge seeing Marley's face on the biblical murals, and Scrooge asking Christmas yet to come to see some tenderness connected with the death. We also get references to the literary characters Scrooge loved as a boy and the wandering spirits. I hope this is clear from the episode, but I don't consider this my favorite version just because it keeps a lot of stuff from the book. It understands the book and it keeps the spirit of the book, which is so much more important. Additionally, it works to engage us as a film, not just a visual representation of the book. The book exists, you can read it. Christmas Carol 1984 is a great movie and a great adaptation of the book. Next week, I will be covering a much less known adaptation called John Grin's Christmas, so stay tuned for that, and stay tuned on this episode for some more personal thoughts and facts about this movie. And thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Okay, so that is A Christmas Carol 1984, a movie that is very, very special to me. As I've made clear in this episode, it is my favorite version, and there are a lot that obviously I like, a good number that I love, but this one tops them all. This one, of the ones I've seen, and again, this could change. If it does, I would be shocked, but pleasantly surprised if something knocks this off the top spot in my mind, because I really, really think this is a great take on the story. So many of them you can say, well, it starts with the actor playing Scrooge, or it starts with the script. And this is why this is a great version, because in this version, I can't even say, oh, it's clearly the greatest because of the performance of Scrooge, or it's clearly the greatest because of the script, because it's both. It's the best script, and it's the best performance as Scrooge. And those two factors, hand in hand, make this clearly the best version in my mind. Visually, yes, it is a TV movie from the 1980s, but I think visually this one is more interesting than most of the movie versions so far. Not all, but with a lot of those older ones, like they're so clearly shot on sets. And again, I've talked about these sets versus on location thing before, and nothing against shooting on sets, but in my opinion, the 1938 one and the 1970 musical both really struggle from obvious sets. I'm not going to complain about the TV versions doing that because they're TV versions from the 50s. That's what you're going to have. But the 38 and the 1970 version both have a real level of fakery to the sets. And I know some people love that for musicals, and I think it works in certain musicals. But this one just feels so lived in. The 1951 version, there are some scenes in my mind where the sets are kind of obvious and other scenes where it's not a problem at all. That doesn't really bother me too much in the 51 film, but there is a scene or two where I'm like, yeah, all right, this is a set. The 1935 film, that doesn't bother me at all because I think it adds to kind of the cramped, dark feeling of that film. That one really has a unique vibe to it. It's very grim, very bleak, and I really like that. And then you do, of course, still in that version get the scene where they go out to sea, so it doesn't stay in that one location. So the 1935 film, not guilty of that, even though it is shot on sets as well, I'm sure. obviously, the best looking film visually so far has to be the Richard Williams cartoon, and I don't see that being topped. In my personal opinion, that animation style is just incredible. But I really do think the lived-in look of the 1984 film is one of the things that's so interesting about it. Again, visually not the top of the list, but I think the scenes shot, in Shropshire, in a real town made to look like Victorian England, it just gives it more room to breathe. Everything feels very, very real. You see Scrooge walking the streets, and you see those past scenes that I think that's really where it comes out, is the past and the present scenes, because you can tell you're just in a real place. And yeah, it's wonderful. That aside, the script is just so smart. It really cares about why these characters are saying these lines, and it really cares about getting the dialogue out in the best way. It's not just, here's a line from the book, we're gonna copy and paste, which the Michael Horton version does, and a lot of versions do. This version doesn't really say to any line in the book, honestly, well, this is so iconic, we couldn't change it. And I appreciate it for taking that chance. I don't think of this as a wildly derivative adaptation. It's not. But there are some people who'd be so beholden to the book. And we've all seen this with adaptations of this book and other books, but they don't change anything, and that's not engaging. That doesn't lead to good filmmaking. So, yeah, I really appreciate the chances this one takes. And, rearranging words, rewriting lines just for the sake of it sounding more natural. And of course, George C. Scott. Just absolutely an incredible performance. One of my favorite actors, but admittedly one of my favorite actors because of this movie. Not quite sure when I first saw this version. Again, I've mentioned this before. When I was young, growing up, I watched a version if it was on TV. No matter what it was, I was going to see it. So I had seen this version when I was young, couldn't tell you the first time. I have some memory of that scene where the poor couple is under the bridge. And I would have said maybe I was like 10, but I'm totally guessing because I hadn't seen that scene in another version because it's original to this one. So I remember seeing that, and then I saw it, in high school again. And I think that was when I realized just how good it was. We watched it in an English class in high school, and I realized there was really a lot to like about this version, and particularly Scott's performance as Scrooge. George C. Scott, I mean, just what a career. The rare actor from that era whose late years of his career still turned in some incredible performances. Now, to be fair, uh, there's not as big of a gap between the beginning of his career and the end as you might think. Scott always looked older than he was, so he's maybe not as old as you're thinking he is here in his later performances, but up through the early 90s, he was still turning in great work. Obviously, he had Patton and he had Doctor Strangelove, broke out in Anatomy of a Murder, which he's fantastic in. But, in the 80s and 90s, he did Hardcore, a pretty underrated movie. And in the 90s, he did Exorcist 3, which, like, there's a level of George C. Scott. He's a very charismatic actor, obviously, and very over the top when he needed to be. Not in this at all. He's really dialed in here, but either when the director wanted it or when he was just given free reign, he did tend to go over the top, and I think people liked him for it. It works in Patton, it works in Strangelove, right? Exorcist 3 is like the final George C. Scott performance that is the right level of over the top. I feel like that's the breaking point before he went too far. When you see his like cameo in what's that Alec Baldwin movie? He has a cameo in as a doctor, and it's just Malice, called Malice. He has a absolutely over the top scene in that, which is ridiculous. And the whole movie's ridiculous. But Exorcist 3 is like that final George C. Scott great performance. And then you get to like his TV movies in the 90s with 12 Angry Men and Inherit the Wind, and he's just not turning in the same work he was doing before. A lot of bluster, not a lot of great acting, sadly. Still, he's still George C. Scott, but the 80s, he really gave some great understated performances. The one of my favorite horror movies, a haunted house movie he did in 1980, was called The Changeling. Great, great movie. George C. Scott plays a very mellow music teacher, composer, I believe, who has lost his family. They died in a tragic accident. He moves into a new house, turns out to be haunted. And in that, none of the George C. Scott isms are really there. There's one or two scenes where he kind of yells, and it's justified that he yells, but he's very mellow and very kind in that. And by many accounts, that's who he was at that point in his life, which is really nice to see. That's really why I like the end of his Christmas Carol because he's so genuine in those scenes. I mean, obviously he's acting, but it feels like he's not acting. It's just such a genuine, lovely performance. And yeah, like David Warner said, he was a lot of fun to work with. Really pleasant at this point in his career, apparently, which is great to hear as someone who obviously is a fan of his work. It's nice to hear that he really mellowed out by the end of his life and had maybe something of a Scrooge-like transformation. So yeah, George C. Scott in this, just an amazing performance. Probably my favorite George C. Scott performance, and that's a man who has many, many incredible performances. But yeah, I think a Scrooge first. It's so good. A lot of other great people in this movie too. I talked about them in the review, obviously. David Warner. David Warner, another one of my favorite actors. Great, great British character actor. I think he got typecast as villains, stereotyped as villains, but in so many of his movies, he actually plays pretty decent guys. You've seen The Omen, he's a pretty nice guy in that. I was just rewatching In the Mouth of Madness, one of my favorite John Carpenter movies. He's a fairly nice person in that. So, plenty of animated voice roles. He had a villain role on Twin Peaks, just a great actor. He's missed. And yeah, just on down the line with Roger Rees giving us, in my mind, the definitive Fred. I could just ramble for a long time about this, but yeah, it's such a great version of the story. And yeah, I mean, another part of it is just there's not anything wrong with this. There's no real issue I have with it. I think it's a fairly underwhelming Marley scene, but I'm kind of picky about Marley scenes, I've noticed, because I don't think I'm asking for much, but it seems like a lot of versions play it differently than I imagine it, or I would want it to be. I just want a little camaraderie between Scrooge and Marley, something of a friendship that was there, and I feel like that's often missing in adaptations. They just go for a really, really big performance and a really, really big scene. And I wish this one did a little more. It does okay, but I wish it went a little more into the humanization of Marley as opposed to the ghost aspect. I think it's a little over the top. And it's just a little underwhelming compared to the rest of the movie. It's not staged very interestingly. The room is set up kind of weird compared to the other Scrooge bedrooms. That's a really minor note, I realize. But it's just not set up in the same kind of interesting way. So I just don't think it works quite as well as some. But it's still not bad. Yeah. 1984, A Christmas Carol. So much to love here. And really, really cares about the message of the story, including that additional scene of the family under the bridge, which I've always loved. And obviously, keeping ignorance in want, it keeps so much of the dark stuff from the book. The yet to come scene is really, really perfectly dark and a lot of yeah, horror movie moments in this, it feels like, and there's a lot of cast in this who have been known for horror movies, so that's not surprising. It's very interesting to me that this and Scrooged both have a director named Donner. Just one of those interesting things. They both directed an iconic Christmas movie, and they happen to have the name Donner, so that's kind of fun. Richard Donner directed Scrooged, and Clive Donner directed this. Yeah, I think its reputation as a TV movie is kind of an unfair thing to say because yeah, it was a movie on TV by all means, but in the UK it wasn't. It was released theatrically, and I think it deserved that. It really has a lot of love poured into this from every aspect. I'm gonna link an episode of the podcast Totally Rad Christmas where they interviewed the composer of the score for this. If you're a music person, you will find it fascinating. Even if you're not, you will. But if you're a music person, which I am not. I'm not a composer. I'm not a musician. But I found it very interesting. So if you're into that, you're going to find it really interesting because this is a really, really great score. Really beautiful. I've heard some people say it's a little too loud at points, but I think the loud score, I used to have an issue with it myself, but it's mostly in the yet to come scenes. And I think that's a way for the ghost to speak. The ghost also does have like this cemetery gate screech noise, which is kind of interesting, but I think the music actually kind of works as the voice of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. But what people forget is in the book, there is a scene where Scrooge hears poetry, and we are led to believe, at least, that it's probably the way the ghost is communicating to him. So it's not that the ghost doesn't have things to say. I like the music kind of being the voice of the ghost of Christmas yet to come here. And again, that's my read on it. Maybe that's not how it's supposed to be, but for me, it reads that way, that the music is actually the ghost speaking. So that's pretty cool. So that is A Christmas Carol 1984. Next week, I'm looking at a much more obscure one called John Grin's Christmas. Robert Guillaume stars and directs this TV. I'm going to say TV movie. I'm going to call it a TV movie, even though it's only an hour long with commercials, because it's not a special in my mind. It's not a variety show. It's not based on an existing show. It's not a special episode of a TV show. It is a TV movie. It just happens to be an hour long. So Robert Guillaume stars, directs, and it is an all-black cast. So we are looking at that next week. Thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Colin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks, and TRG Banks' Snowfall is used for interstitial music. Clips in this episode are from A Christmas Carol 1984 and A Christmas Carol 1977. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. You can also back me on Patreon for early episodes, bonus episodes, and the right to vote in polls. Link is in the description. I'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.